Hey witches, it's Lee and this is Do the Magical Thing, and I thought we'd have a little chat about sigils and sigil magic. And let's start with the definition. Essentially, sigils are a symbol. They're a pictorial representation of a being or a desire. And these two concepts, if you like, being and desire, really reflect the two main trains of thought when it comes to sigil magic throughout occult history. And keeping with history, if we look at the etymology of the word, we see it comes from sign or signature. And signature really brings to mind a key occult text, the Lesser Key of Solomon. Within it, the Goetia, or 72 signatures of various beings, spirits or demons. And I think it's really worth considering perhaps the more Greek definition of the term demon or daemon as an advisor here. Now, why would you really want to have these signatures? What does it give you? Well, I think this from the Book of Grimoires by Claude Lecoulteau gives us some insight. A fundamental rule of magic is that the names of numinous and supernatural beings must be at the magician's disposal, or magician's disposal, so that they can be summoned and compelled to appear and act. Without the names, everything will be in vain. And these signatures were considered to be the true names of these beings. True names are something that come up in terms of fairy tales quite a lot. You know, once you know the true name of a being, you have power over it. And if you think about our own signatures, they give us the power to authorise certain things, to agree or sign a contract of some kind. And it makes sense that we guard this, because if we then have anybody having our signature, they then also gain the power and authority that gives us. Now, why would you want this power and authority? Well, appear and act, as Claude Lecoulteau says, and with these beings, with these demons, or with angels, because there were seals and signatures of angels too, you may be seeking to do one of two things, really. One might be to invoke or bring into yourself the attributes of this being, and you might want to be seeking protection. You might be wanting to appeal to it in some fashion. The other thing is you may want to evoke, you might want to bring them out, perhaps contained within a circle, and quiz these beings for knowledge, for perhaps an exchange of some kind, or maybe just to really get to grips with what it is they're about. I think it's worth considering this from 2 points of view. As you know, I'm non-theist, and so I'm not someone who believes in deities necessarily. Spirits I can understand, but I think it's worth thinking of these angels and demons as a representation of our psyche, of virtues and of vices. Now, these are essentially things that we might want to go towards or move away from. Or perhaps, if we're going to be brave, we could explore why it is or where the power comes from these beings. So a demon, perhaps you might want to sort of evoke and quiz and really kind of understand, sort of, if you like, exercise this particular demon. And I think this is essentially a form of shadow work. Once we confront the parts of ourselves that we're not particularly keen on, we then gain power over it. Now, that's the kind of being sigil, essentially, or the use of being sigils. And you know, I think it's something that's explored mainly in ceremonial magic and by demonologists, and really sort of it's more of a process. And there are certain sigils and seals that have very specific things, and they are specifically for certain beings. Well, the being aspect, as I say, we've kind of covered here. Now, the desire aspect, those two paths that I mentioned, the desire aspect really brings us to Austin Osman Spare, who was an occultist and artist, and quite an underrated figure when it comes to occult history. Now, with Austin Osman Spare, we have the benefit of his biographer to give us a really nice definition of his take, essentially, on sigils. He says that the big difference with Spare's method, essentially to what we've just discussed, is that he dispensed with pre-existing esoterica and external beliefs. So the sigils were no longer for controlling traditional demons, angels and what have you, but instead for controlling forces in the unconscious psyche of the individual operator, the magician being the individual operator. In the book Practical Sigil Magic by Frater UD, he compounds on this kind of ridding of any excess and says that it's one of the most efficient and economical disciplines of magic, and for the most part can be performed without complicated rituals, needs hardly any paraphernalia, is independent of philosophical dogmatic premises, and due to its simplicity can be learned easily and quickly. And I really think this is quite a key point, and it's something that I really value around the Austin Osman Spare method, which is that anybody can do it. Essentially, if we're going to go through it very sort of briefly, and we'll explore creating a sigil in more detail soon, but essentially you have a phrase, a statement of desire or of a goal that you want to reach, and then you remove the repeated letters, perhaps you remove the vowels as well, and then with the remaining letters you create a pictorial representation, you create a kind of linear symbol, a glyph, and that is essentially the really sort of concentrated meaning or desire. And because it's in this sort of jumble, this unrecognisable, other than perhaps yourself, meaning, it's then something that you can absorb as a symbol into your subconscious to let it get to work there. And there's various different methods of how to kind of activate it, whereas with the more ceremonial magic you might have specific words, movements and rituals there. With the Austin Osman Spare method, or the sort of chaos sigil method if you like, with that essentially you create the symbol, you then charge it with either your focus, perhaps you use some kind of energetic release, so it could be laughter, it could be an orgasm. There's definitely elements of that sort of using of that ecstasy and that moment of sort of liminal space to get this sigil out into the kind of unconscious, if you like, or the subconscious there. You perhaps might burn it, right? And there are other options too. You can also keep it in sort of plain sight so that it becomes a bit like your fridge. You know, your fridge is there and it's great and it's helpful, but it's not something you notice first when you walk into the kitchen necessarily. With a sigil that you keep and put somewhere, you're really letting it become part of the furniture so that it goes really from your conscious mind, from your kind of thinking aspect to more your manifesting aspect, to a sort of something that just is and exists and can work away in the background, rather than this kind of desperate grasping for it. You're letting it just sort of sit and be. And so with this sigil method you can see how versatile it is, because literally any desire you have can be written in this way, and you can make some wonderfully simple sigils very quickly on a back of a napkin or envelope or whatever it is. And I've had some really great ones, and really, we're going from sigils that look perhaps like, I'll try and find an example for you, but perhaps the sort of more complex kind of sigils or aspects like so, or perhaps the kind of some of these are charms rather than sigils, but essentially you go from the more complex sigils to something that is very, very simple, such as, and I'll show you again in Frater UD's wonderful practical sigil magic. You could go to something like this, and this really is a combination, and you can see here what kind of letters might make up this. You can see that it could be an M, it could be an E, it could be a W, all this sort of stuff. So with this accessibility, with this concentration, it gives us a great deal of versatility, and it means that anybody in their own respective languages can do this, right? And that's what I think is so wonderful about this, and the fact you can do it so off the cuff. Children can do it, anybody can really create this magic. It makes it something that's very much dear to my heart, and something that I really value as a tool to empower. And actually, again, in Frater UD's work, he mentions that none of the magical techniques we know of today are more efficient and will give even beginners the immediate chance to convince themselves of its power and their own abilities. So that's really something that's quite lovely. Now, we also can look at sigils not just as something that we create, but are kind of created in our society. And it's this weird thing when it comes to walking down a street that you realise how many things could be considered sigils. And Grant Morrison, the artist essentially, and graphic novelist, mentions this and has quite a sort of damning impression or a damning statement about sigils. It says that corporate sigils are super breeders. They attack unbranded imaginative space. And I think that's quite an interesting concept, unbranded imaginative space. They invade Red Square, they invest the cranky streets of Tibet, they etch themselves into hairstyles, they breed across clothing, turning people into advertising hoardings. The logo or brand, like any sigil, is a condensation, a compressed symbolic summoning up of the world of desire, which the corporation intends to represent. Walt Disney died long ago, but his sigil, that familiar cartoonist signature, and again we're going back to signature here, persists, carrying its own vast weight of meanings, associations, nostalgia, and significance. So when you're walking down the street, think about, how many things are technically sigils and what they evoke in you. This can give you a real clue as to the power of sigils. If you think this is perhaps too simple, how can something scribbled on the back of an envelope create something tangible? Well, I can tell you now that something that I've scribbled onto, a bit of paper and then written on a bay leaf has manifested quite significantly in my life in various ways. And sigils are one of those things that I use time and time again. And we can also see sigils as symbols of power in protests, in particular signs or particular phrases that become greater than they are, and they become essentially what we would call perhaps an egregore or a sort of group sigil, this conjuration of meaning. Hopefully this rundown has given you some ideas, some food for thought around sigils and seeing how versatile and easy they are and where there are room for really exploration. And I think that's a great thing about sigils. They can be really fun as much as they have these sort of aspects that perhaps have certain cultural weight to them. We're going to come up with our own sigils to really give you some practical use for this and get yourself some magical muscles working. We've done the magical theory, let's do the magical thing. Okay, witches, here's our magical thing to do. So we're going to use the Austin Osman Spare method of creating a sigil, and we're going to use the phrase health and wealth. This is something that we're going to create a sigil for to increase it, or at least to maintain it. And so what we want to do, as I mentioned before, is take out the repeated letters, and you might want to take out the vowels as well. This tends to be a popular way of doing it. And if we do that, we end up with HLTDW. And with this, you can immediately see it's far more easy to work with in terms of working out what we can actually make out of it. And let's start with the H. So with this, what kind of shape would you really break it down into? If you thought of it rather than a letter, what sort of shapes there are? Well, the H is kind of like pretty much like a sort of gate or a goal in some fashion. But you would perhaps also look at it in the lowercase sort of way, more curved, perhaps something that's giving us a sense of increase with that movement. And with the L, we might want to look at it, rather than the capital again, look at some sort of curvature there with the edge here. And with the T, we could also do the same thing. In fact, you could put that on its top and have it like so. This could also represent the D aspect there in its curve, and we could also perhaps look at the W if we spun this on its head to being like so. And now we've got more options to make this a bit more obscure, to make it less obvious to anybody else. Obviously we're going to know what this sigil's for, but we want it to kind of look not quite mundane. We want to give it a little bit of a magical edge. Now, with health and wealth, it's worth considering, what do you feel are your associations with health and wealth? You might want to add in, as well as shapes, perhaps some symbols or some related kind of imagery or things that evoke this kind of concept to you. So you can do this with any sigil, but and any subject, really, but this is going to be our focus. So let's consider, if we're wanting to increase it, we might want to look at some kind of arrow. And this again gives us perhaps some options to put the T in there. And you could also think of, health being something that is whole, so a circle of some kind. This also represents spirit as well. And perhaps you could, in fact, add, if we think about abundance and things that really are healing and all that sort of thing, you might think of the sun. And the astrological symbol for the sun is like so. Now, keep it simple. You don't have to include these symbols. You can just stick with the letters and just make the sort of basic shapes out of them to then put into a solid, congruent pictorial representation of your desire. But I think this gives you a nice little step to add some flourishes, and this is talked about by Frater UD in his work, The Practical Sigil Magic. So with this, as I say, don't get too arty, don't get too fussy about it. It doesn't have to be perfect. I'm not a fan of arty sigils because I feel like they miss the point. They miss the point of its economic and quick and very sort of basic methodology, really. The idea is you're able to do this on the back of a napkin and be able to cast it, get it out there, and then forget about it very quickly. So let's move on to the sigil. We've got our shapes, we've got some potential flourishes there, and so if we're thinking about the sort of movement we wanted to increase, we might start from the bottom. So with this H here, you might want to bring it up like so. And this kind of reminds me a bit like a plant as well. You've got almost this sort of sprouts, if you like, and perhaps a leaf of some kind. And now we want to really sort of give some movement to this, and so we might give it a little bit of an orbit to get our health and wealth really kicking into gear. And so from this point we can look at this curve. This gives us the D, if you like, and it also gives us the L. We might want to add the W in here by popping a little line here, and we could also add a line perhaps here for the T. And this gives us a quite witchy looking little thing. It doesn't look like anything normal, not like a normal letter. But when we're going upwards like here and creating this sense, we want something, really for this health and wealth to be stored in, or to at least be centered in. And so let's have our circle on the end here. And why not pop in that dot as well? And this then also somewhat looks like a flower of some kind, or a plant, again, growth and all that kind of thing. And we can really emphasize that by adding two little arrowheads at the bottom. And now we have something that looks kind of rooted in and also flourishing, with some defense there, if you like, with some kind of thorns. And this really gives us this nice, simple sigil that we can apply to so many different things. So you've got the letters, look at the shapes, consider what options you have there to break them down, make them unrecognisable, or at least not easy to see at first glance. Add in any symbols for those flourishes at the edges. Some people use lines, some people use the circles. You could even use, for instance, if you were doing some sort of defensive sigil, you could incorporate symbols like Mars, or if you're looking for love, you might look at the sort of Venus symbol, incorporate that there in some fashion. So this gives you a good idea of how you can go about using these different sort of methods, or at least the Austin Osman Spare method. Now, the subject of where comes into this. Where are you going to put this sigil? Well, there are several options, and this is not just for the health and wealth sigil, but for any kind of sigil that you have. You could pop it on the inside of a belt. Maybe you're going to work and you want something inconspicuous, or it's for a child, on the inside of their belt, or on the bottom of a shoe. You could write it on the sole of a shoe, either inside or outside, and maybe it could be activated by the walking and the wearing down of the ink. Maybe you might want to pop it on a flower pot to increase the abundance of that particular plant, or you might pop it on your bank card to increase your prosperity, or perhaps on a card that you send to a person who maybe they're looking at some poor luck, or whatever it happens to be. You might want to send them a wish, and for all intents and purposes it could be a kind of arty card, but it's charged with an intent that is aiming to really give them a bit of a boost. You could also save the sigil in plain sight on your phone. Remember, the two options really you have are to kind of burn or focus on this symbol and then release it either energetically, laughter, orgasming, anything along that kind of, making some sort of energetic release. Or you might want to look at keeping it in plain sight and having it become, part of the background, like your fridge in your home. As I say, it's really something that you don't automatically see when you walk into the kitchen. It's just sort of there, but it's something that it kind of becomes background noise. And so on your phone you could have a sigil, and after a while you'll kind of forget what it is. It'll just become normal, and that's where it can sort of work on the subconscious level. You could say that you were activating it or charging it each time you opened your phone and revealed the sigil. Again, you could look at perhaps just writing it on a bit of paper and storing it in your phone case. And you might want to look at just drawing it in front of you or on you, or using soap of some kind. Perhaps if you're cleansing in the shower or whatever it might be, you might want to use the soap to draw a sigil on yourself, or indeed on others, with their consent, of course. And as I say, you can just burn the sigils and that's it, they're done. I like to have a little catalogue of sigils that I can reuse where needed, and I feel this gives them an energy that is stored within them and then built upon with each time that they're used. But it's also fun to create new versions of similar themes. And really, this shows you just how versatile it is. I'm sure there are places right now you're thinking that you could put a sigil that you might make. Pick any sentence, put it in the positive, that perhaps you, rather than putting I want to be or I would like or all that sort of stuff, be more assertive and go, I am prosperous, I am healthy, I am whatever it happens to be, So this gives you, as I say, a bit of a broad overview. With the health and wealth sigil, this is my own, and I would really encourage you to create your version, your take on this particular phraseology, or a phrase you like. But really give it a go. It's one of those most simple and effective magics you can really get out there. As I say, don't worry about it looking pretty. It doesn't have to look pretty. It just has to work. And the best thing, and this is what Austin Osman Spare's point really was, is that it comes from your creation. And really the main thing that matters is that you are the person who has created it. And this is why I'm not so keen on copying copying other sigils from people, blogs, or whatever it happens to be. If it's for a particular, cause of some kind, then it becomes more of a sort of egregore, if you like, a kind of group sigil, and I think that's slightly different. But do try and get stuck in doing the magical thing. In the meantime, health and wealth.